Hello everyone, today we talk about the Seljuk Turks and their relation with the Islamic world. I'm always glad when I can go beyond the usual boundaries within which I normally remain when talking about medieval history relatively to Western Europe, which is a relatively narrow perspective, especially when talking about medieval history, whichever period of it you want to take into consideration, and especially the topic of the Seljukian Empire, and all the consequences that it had in Eurasian history. I think are an extremely sensible topic today, because I think there is a general interest towards the Crusades and the concept of clash between West and East and stuff like that. And I think that talking about the Seljuk Turks in this sense is also a way to get a broader picture of the whole thing. The Seljuks were extremely important for the same Western European history, if anything, because of the Crusades. The Crusades were started basically because the Seljuk Turks had expanded into the Near East by coming to control the holy places of Christianity, and this in part obviously was one of the reasons that triggered the same Crusades. And even during the same Crusades, the Seljuk Turks were the major opponents, especially up to a certain point, and also the other communities that lived into the Near East and came and go sometimes had been in some way deeply influenced by these people. Now I decided to call this video the Seljuk Turks and the Islamic world, so kind of giving the impression of dividing the two things. And this is what I want to stress mostly, or better, it refers to the fact that the Turks in general were, originally speaking, an extraneous component within the broad Islamic world at the time in which they entered it. The Islamic world was an extremely complex one at the time. The Seljuks entered in contact with it, and it was extremely complex because it was, the only common, element was the Islamic faith, or Islamic religion, if you prefer. For the rest, the so-called Islamic lands that obviously from the West, both I'd say at those times and today are kind of instinctively, maybe, I don't know why, it's cultural, but they are instinctively perceived as a very homogeneous and compact world. Actually, it was extremely diverse within its boundaries. Think about, for instance, the same differences between the Muslims as religious groups, the Sunnah and the Shia. Think about the languages that were spoken there, from Arab to Persian to Berber, and all the ethnicities that were present with all their pre-Islamic traditions into the Islamic world, and obviously the presence of Christians and of Jews in the same Islamic lands. So a really kind of messed up situation, especially considering that the original Caliphate empire had basically declined, and by the 10th, 11th century, so in the same time in which the Turks enter in, the Islamic world was living an internal crisis, a political division, and the Seljuk Turks were some of those who were a people that managed in many ways to put in motion what was and reviving in part what was declining into the into the Islamic world, in part accelerating the decline of certain institutions that existed within the same Islamic lands, in part by creating new ones and creating also a lot of problems to those who were against them, including the Westerners, thinking about the Byzantines or the Crusaders, but even the same Muslims in many occasions. As we were saying, this Turkish element was external to the Islamic world at this point, and the Turks were of an extremely different from an ethnic and a linguistical point of view from the Arabs and for instance, the Indo-European Persians, that were the major ethnicities living in the Islamic boundaries. And while the Turks, in fact, belong to another stock that is the Uralo-Altaic one, that is essentially close to the Mongolian one, and spoke a language belonging to the greater Ugro-Finnic linguistical family. The Turks were originary of northeastern Asia or Central Asia, depending which balance you want to give to this space. But let's say that after a long migration, they had come to occupy by the 10th century a very wide Asian area that is the one you can see even here in the map, that is roughly around the borders with India, Persia, and even the ones of China that we can't see here, but they were essentially in this Central Asian area, part of the Middle East already, but essentially at the gates of the sedentarized world, because the Turkish political and social structure was essentially confederative, that is akin to all the socio-political asset organization of the migrating peoples. Even thinking about the migration era, they were essentially confederations, which means they were made up by several different tribes, sometimes even very different from the one from the other, with very different ethnical origins, at the top of which was the so-called Kagan, that it literally means the Lord of Peoples. So even from this title, you can understand the multi-ethnic composition of these groups. So that in fact, when we talk about Turks, we shouldn't overly stress the genetic homogeneity of these peoples. Actually, the Eurasian steppes had been since always, from millennia, this huge cauldron of ethnicities of different origins, and namely, especially there were these two huge blocks. There were the Indo-European one and the Turkish and Mongolian one. And in many occasions, these groups had also intermarried in many ways, so it couldn't be difficult to find between even the same Turks, people with blonde hair, blue eyes, coming, I don't know, descending from the Indo-European peoples of Sarmatia, for instance, or the Tokharians close to China. So when we talk about a Turkish identity from this point of view, we're mostly talking about a linguistical identity, because in the steppe, all these great confederations tended to absorb quite quickly the external elements, and to essentially make them adopting their own ethnicity from a cultural point of view. So this happened even in more recent times. Think about the Ukrainian steppes and the Cossacks. The Cossacks were originally also Turkish in origin, but basically the modern Cossacks are also largely people of even Slavic origin, blue-eyed and blonde-haired. So, and yet they speak Cossack, etc. But even something even more, think about Hungary. Hungary had been conquered by the Hungars, who were also incidentally Turkish, and today the Hungarians are a largely Slavic people in terms of ethnic origins, yet they still speak an Ugro-Finnic language, which is extremely fascinating. Or even think about Finland, that is the widest country in the world, but they speak essentially an Ugro-Finnic language, just like Turkey, for instance. So that gives you probably a good understanding of the identitary fluidity of these groups, especially in the steppes where political changes could be very sudden, and in order to survive in this very flat but kind of hard and hostile environment, you had essentially to integrate into these other groups if you wanted to leave. And the term Kagan, so the lords of peoples, was eventually shortened in the more famous Khan. So obviously everything that comes from Genghis Khan, for instance, all the titles that basically remained in the Turkish or Mongolian derived states, even during the modern age, essentially stemmed from this root, this linguistical root. And in this sense, I believe it's very fascinating that when the Crusaders arrived in the Near East at the end of the 11th century, they probably didn't even imagine the fact, because they were quite ignorant at that time, that meeting the Turks that we will be seeing at that time, having settled into the Near East at that point, was essentially meeting with very close relatives of those who had been the Huns, the Bulgars, the Avars, and the Hungars that the same Westerners had known pretty well between the 5th and the 10th century. So this for saying that the same, sometimes it's even a matter of perception. When we talk about not much about the Huns, but usually about the Hungars, the Bulgars, and the Avars, we tend, as Westerners, to kind of consider them as part of our own world. In many ways, I'm not an Eastern European, but I can imagine that there is a kind of pride and in thinking of descending from these peoples that, however, were not Europeans and that yet gave the names to places like Hungary, to Bulgaria, and that kind of live even in the traditions of these essentially white people today, as a symbol of European identity and so on. And telling the truth, by the time, this is probably a modern perspective, but at the time of the Crusades, when the so-called Franks left from Western Europe to the Near East to recover the holy places, there was in their historiography that probably most of them didn't read, but it could be echoed quite strongly into the chivalric epics, for instance. It was still quite present, the threat and the cruelty, and the one that had been perceived as such of these peoples of the steppes, from especially the Huns, that since the Romans wrote about them and fought against them, were probably the most known. The Huns were also present in the German epics, so it's interesting to think how the Indo-Europeans and the Turks kind of met each other continuously throughout history, both in Asia and in Europe, and how paradoxically our civilization today stems also in part from the outcome of this meeting, or whether it turned into warfare or into cultural exchange. But what I find fascinating in talking about a topic like the one of the Seljuk Turks is conceiving these a greater dimension of the Eurasian steppes and of the Eurasian continent as a whole that we often tend to ignore as such, meaning that our historical horizons are quite often set in a sedentary perspective. I mean, even during the Middle Ages, when we think about Christians and Muslims, we generally think about the two great civilizations that spread at this time, essentially from the ancient Greek and Roman cultural basis. Think about the cities, think about the written tradition, etc., that are referred to an essentially sedentary world. And yet, the Arabs came, they were kind of semi-nomadic, but the Turks that eventually took over the Near and Middle East and the Europeans as Indo-Europeans essentially came from that step that it was kind of the womb of the same Indo-European civilization in many ways, and that today we tend to ignore as something Eastern or exotic or far away, but that's really the cradle of Western civilization in many ways. You can argue about that because obviously people can can assume that the Western civilization was born with the Greeks or the Romans, but we cannot ignore the strictly ethnic origins of the European peoples that were originally nomadic peoples coming from the steppes. So even the Greeks and the Romans originally came from there. So they didn't perceive them as such, obviously, even in their age, but a lot of their traditions and cultures, and even their own religion, is part of a greater cauldron of Indo-Europeism that stretches from the Atlantic Sea to Western China and India, that has, telling the truth, still a lot in common in certain perspectives, in this perspective at least. So, talking about now strictly the Seljuk Turks, it's who were these guys? Essentially, they were a tribe coming from Turkmenistan around the 11th century, and we are not really sure whether the Seljuks were really Turks. Because, as we have seen, the steppes were a quite multi-ethnic place, so we don't really have, historically speaking, a lot of evidence of what kind of identity these guys were. I made maybe that can explain it the thing better. I made a video about the origins of the Huns, and there we have the same exact problem, that for these peoples that in the steppes were nomads, they didn't write, they didn't leave any labelable, let's say, trace of their individual identity. It's very hard to say who was who there, and we essentially don't even know who these guys were in origin. So we say Seljuk Turks, but knows, and they were called Seljuks because simply their Khan was called Seljuk. So hence the adjective Seljukid, that I believe also in English it exists, at least in my language. It is so. And what's interesting about these peoples is that they had, similarly to what had happened into into the late antique world, they had started to gravitate since some century around the borders of the sedentary empires, which is interesting because you would imagine that nomadic peoples had kind of of environment on their own, but actually reading history you understand that there was always a very strict interaction in spite of the political and social differences between the nomads and the sedentary peoples, and obviously the nomads being always attracted towards the sedentary lands. First, chiefly, obviously, because the nomads tend to find always a good opportunity to raid, because their steppes economy pushes them to live out of loot, and therefore, if like in this case of the Islamic world of the 10th and 11th century, there is a political crisis, that can be a very good moment to strike and to go make a very big ride into into the sedentaries lands. But this is also reductive explanation, because obviously in the moment into which the nomads get into contact with the sedentaries, they also kind of start to know the sedentary world and wonder if it isn't, a better place to live than their nomadic or semi-nomadic society. And this is something actually very comparable throughout all these very large migration era. This is something you can see into the Germanic perspective, into the Hunnic perspective, into the Turkish perspective. So what happens to these Seljuk Turks at a certain point is that in a few decades they get converted to Islam. To this, I would like to add a reflection that is, there is always often this, I don't know if it is a stereotype or a misunderstanding, that more primitive societies are more traditionalist. There is nothing more wrong with this. Usually the most traditionalist societies are the ones who have built a more complex society, so that they have set their mind over something so, big and relatively stable, that it's more difficult for them culturally to adapt to new beliefs, to new customs, etc. When instead you see more primitive societies, especially nomadic or semi-nomadic one, you can make fitting in even the Vikings, or like in this case the Turks, what you find is that telling the truth, they have much less cultural resistance to novelty than what you may think. Actually, even the same Germanic peoples converted to Christianity quite fast. I mean, they didn't have, they might have an immediate resistance due to the fact that Christianization would equate to a foreign conquest, to be conquered by the enemies. Think about Charles the Great with the Saxons. But generally speaking, and especially like in this case of the Seljuks, when you see that there is a profitable situation for you, like entering to be a part of a large empire that has a lot of riches you can live off, well, you don't have really many resistance to convert from your polytheistic or even animistic sometimes beliefs, like the one existing in the steppes, to a monotheism like the Islamic one. And that's what the Seljuks did. And what was the reason for this? Well, quite simply, the Seljuks had been spotted as very good fighters, like most of the Turkish tribes at that time, being excellent horse archers, and the Caliph of Baghdad, so the chief of the theoretically what was conceived the universal, um, um, let's say, I can't say empire of the Muslims, but let's say the universal, yeah, let's say the universal empire of the Muslims decided to hire them as soldiers, essentially. So also in here there are many analogies you can draw with other situations. Also the Romans began to hire Germanic soldiers because of their military prowess, and kind of incorporating and assimilating them into the Roman Empire. Well, with the Turks and the Abbasid Caliphate happened essentially the same. We have to mention the Abbasid Caliphate at this time. What was it really? Originally speaking, the Caliphate it, was ideally the so-called Dar al-Islam in Arab, which basically means equates to the whole Arab world. It's as if, from a Christian perspective, you looked at Christendom as as a whole physical space. Well, the Muslims believed that for themselves, and theoretically, the Caliphate was meant to have this sort of God's guided rule over Earth, a very different perspective from the Christian ones, because the Christian one immediately divided the earthly rule, the secular rule, from the divine rule, meaning that the secular ruler is placed there by God, but earthly justice responds essentially to other laws than the divine one. It should tend to it, but Christianity basically implies that it's not going to work anyway, so you kind of have to accept it. In the Islamic world, it's wholly different, because in the Islamic world you have the idea that mankind should become all Islamic and be ruled according to God's law, that is the Sharia. So this is for this reason the Islamic world had kind of a different political face than the Christian one, because the real the real X factor for ruling, let's say, over the Islamic world was that you had to succeed in everything, because if you failed, it means that it meant basically that God had abandoned you, and other chiefs were allowed to rise. So after this huge regional Islamic expansion, the Islamic world actually had overexpanded, and it began to crumble into various smaller powers. And the Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, that was the one that had theoretically the first place, in the sense that even other caliphates were born incidentally to contest the Abbasid rule, but it had kind of remained the larger or more authoritative power in the Islamic world. Also and especially because it had put its center into Mesopotamia, that was one of the most advanced regions of the world, with its capital Baghdad. This point is probably the most advanced city of the globe, or maybe just in Western Eurasia. I'm not sure about China, etc. But it was considerably weaker compared to the original Abbasid Caliphate that stretched from the Atlantic Sea to the Indus River, but it was still a regional force to be reckoned with, and obviously kind of waged war on its own. And since it was kind of close to the Eurasian steppes, because there was just Persia separating it from them, the hiring of Turkish mercenaries was something very viable and quite convenient from their geographical setting. So the Turks entered quite willingly as in whole blocks like the Seljuk ones. They weren't just singular mercenaries. There were even entire peoples being integrated into the Abbasid Caliphate. But it was a very confused process, telling the truth, and a process that also kind of escaped the control of the same Abbasids in many ways. First of all, there is a characteristic of the Seljuk Turks that I find very interesting, that aside from their early Islamization, the Seljuks were also extremely influenced by the Persian language and customs. Basically, in the Abbasid Baghdad, the language was Arab. Despite even there were very strong Persian influences. Arab remained the main language, but the Turks, in general, was much more familiar. The Turks were much more familiar with Persian than Arab and their culture, and there is probably a reason for this, because actually the Persians were kind of more similar to the Turks in culturally speaking than the Arabs in many ways. The Persians were Indo-European peoples that had also come from the steppes, in much earlier times than that, obviously, and they were especially a feudal society. Now, the Turks weren't really feudal in the sedentary sense of the world, because feudalism implies that, at least from a Western perspective, that you have a piece of land into which you dwell as a sedentary man. But let's say that the society of the steppe is not really a feudal one, but it's still based on the concept that you basically live as a warlord, like in the feudal world, and the way you do it is fighting on horseback. Now, the Persians had a sedentary feudal system that also worked that way. Basically, the Persians had some of the heavier cavalries of the Islamic world, and they shared certain traditions that we can define even as chivalric, and were in this sense also quite similar to the one of the Western world, that in turn had received them from the steppes in its origins, that the Turks would see in turn as very similar to theirs. There was the idea of the prestige of the warlord, of the strength of its retinue, the common style of warfare on horseback. So all things that in Persia were more developed than in Mesopotamia or in the Near East, that were essentially more citizen civilizations in many ways than the Persians, were feudal lords in their system. And therefore what was injected into the Abbasid world, and from it eventually into the rest of the Near East, was a kind of an extraneous element in many ways that, as I was saying before, eventually escaped the same control of the same Abbasids of Baghdad. We will see it in a while. So the Seljuk Turks had, in a very short time, the ability of building an extremely vast empire, starting from the Abbasid Caliphate, to which they had become sort of protectors. Here you have a beautiful map that tells you, the huge expansion of the Seljuk Turks into the Near and Middle East. How did they make it? Well, essentially, their integration into Abbasid Caliphate was a mixed success from the Caliphate point of view, because from one side, effectively, the Turks became very, soldiers who had a relatively strong fealty towards the Caliph of Baghdad. They really fought, in his interests, meaning that the interests of the Mesopotamian Caliphate was a very convenient base for them to expand from. But quite quickly as well, they began to take in hostage the same Caliph, meaning that the Caliph became increasingly more isolated in his beautiful Baghdad's residence. The Turks took over the government for him, made politics, waged war. So a lot of a very good way to enter into possession of the Caliphate's resources, and from them to expand further. So what the Seljuk Turks achieved was the construction of a political and military empire that stretched from Anatolia to central Persia. It's also interesting that the Turks at this point did not really abandon their original political and military mindset, meaning that what you see in here, it's still the presence of substantial, warlords behaviors into the sedentary world. I mean, the idea that the origin of a steppe wasn't really diluted into the sedentary civilization, and it kept on turn maybe keeping the same sedentary civilization in hostage more than else. So there was the idea that the Khan ruled over these lands. The Seljuk Khan, as a matter of fact, took even the title of Sultan for itself. So the word Sultan, it's an Arab word that basically designs the exercise of power, designates the exercise of power, and that even lived into Baghdad. So in this sense, the Seljuk Sultan was a sort of alter ego of the Abbasid Caliph. But the only difference between the two, that he had all the power and the Caliph didn't have any. From Baghdad, the Seljuk Khan ordered a net of military chiefs that were called Aga, and governors that were called either Beg or Atabeg. They presented themselves as, the Seljuks presented themselves as the kind of the shielders, the guardians of Islam. So there was a very strong conception, just like it had happened in the Germanic perspective with the Roman Empire, that the imperial power had been shifted by God from the Arabs to the Turks, as well as from the Romans to the Germans in many ways. And I like very much these analogies. And at this point, as you can see from the map, there were also several several other powers that existed and that were rival of the Seljuk one. The first one, the Fatimid Caliphate. Now you understand that the Fatimid dynasty of Egypt had called itself also a caliphal dynasty, so it was openly contesting the caliphal rule to Abbasid Baghdad. And obviously the Seljuk Turks would be hostile to the Fatimids, because these were contesting their not just the Baghdad's caliph's authority, but also consequently the ones of the Seljuks that were obviously seen as this external barbarian force that had sort of kidnapped the the Arabs living in Mesopotamia. Um, um, and there is also another aspect of this, because obviously it was true, there was a contrast between the Turks and the Arabs in many ways. There was a lot of attrition, especially with the ancient Abbasid bureaucracy that still existed, as the Caliphate of Baghdad was a highly centralized state for those times. So there were the so-called Vali, there were juridical and administrative functionaries of the Caliph, and the emirs, or sheikhs, that were respectively princes, can be translated like this, or the eldermen or of chieftains living in the Arab and Arabo-Persian world that really really like the new the Turkish newcomers. And at this time, however, the Seljuks were quite successful in seizing the control of this extremely huge empire, as you can see from the map. And it is at this point that they also entered in contact with the Westerners. And there is a major event at this point, famously in 1071, that is the Battle of Manzikert. So it's the battle in which the Seljuk Turks clamorously defeated the Byzantine army, together with the Roman Emperor who was leading it. And after that victory, they founded the so-called Rum Sultanate. And this name is very meaningful because Rum means in Arab essentially Rome. So the new Rome, Constantinople, that that in this sense it means that the Turks made an appropriation of the Roman legacy also in many ways. We also conceived the Roman the Roman legacy as a chiefly a Western one, but telling the truth, in the Middle East, the Roman legacy, together with the Persian one, of course, had remained quite strong, quite meaningful, and all the great dynasties that ruled over those lands, including the Seljuks, obviously tried to seize it as a proof of their renewed prestige. And this is also all the more interesting considering that at that time Rome was kind of, I believe, largely considered as a Christian power, even meaning, when you have to think about Roman legacy, the Seljuks weren't so educated at that point to know that, at the point of probably making these reflections, but obviously it was a time in which Rome had been pagan. So maybe what is interesting is that for a medieval mind, and a very peculiar one, like guys coming from the steppes into a senatorial world and forming an empire, it was kind of practicable the division of the political identity from the religious one. So the Seljuks founding the Sultanate of Rome, that is of Rome, with its capital of Iconium in the middle of the Anatolian plateau, is something that, first of all, shows a very great aggressiveness, and that is typical of warlike people like the Turkish one was, but it also is putting the basis for doing something else that is theoretically going even beyond. And the Seljuks would not make it, but the Ottomans would definitely even conquer the same Rome, and taking and taking the Roman legacies on themselves. because among the various titles that the Ottoman sultans would have, there was definitely the one of Roman Emperor. So and I like this because it really stresses, I don't know, it would be also very fascinating what kind of memory the peoples of the steppes, I don't think we can know it, unfortunately, really had of the ancient worlds. You know, they probably had always sensed that there were certain kinds of empires. I mean, the Roman Empire was something so large that you couldn't ignore that. The Eurasian peoples of the steppes have been living continuously between China and Rome for centuries. So it's also possible that the idea of Rome was even something perceived, maybe not in a rational or um, correctly historical way, but at least as a model of power that maybe unconsciously still lived into certain powers at the borders of the steppes, and that the steppes would kind of sense and maybe be attracted by. So it's basically very fascinating to consider what the Seljuks achieved at this time, how deeply they managed to spread the steppes culture into the Arab world, because basically from this time onwards the only dynasties ruling in this place, at least ruling consistent empires, were of not really of Arab origin anymore. They were either Turkish or Kurdish or Mongolian later. So actually mm, a very different group from the Arab ones, and that we had all in common either an Indo-European or a Turkish, or even a mixed between the two identity that had its roots also into cavalry warfare and stuff like that. At this point, one would also like to question why the Arab world really fell and was overrun by these peoples who so much it so much resembles what happened into Europe with the Germans and other nomadic peoples. But let's say that Arab society, just a quick explanation, the Arab society wasn't a very dynamic one. You could argue that just like Arab society in this sense can be compared to Byzantium, and you can say that the Arabs stay at the Turks like Byzantium stays at the West. Meaning what? Meaning that both the Arab and so the Abbasid Caliphate and the Byzantine empires had been the great heirs of the Roman Empire, because they both had inherited. Well, obviously the Byzantines were the Roman Empire proper, but the Arab Empire had basically had been created over the same Byzantine cities. It had been fed with Hellenistic culture. Still, think about all the Hellenistic manuscripts existing in Egypt and Palestine and Syria when the Arabs invaded it. The Arabs, they both had external influences, even, especially the Arabs were quite influenced by the Persians at a point. Even the Byzantines were quite influenced by the Persians, but they also had other influences. They had Slavic influences. They had other, they interacted with different peoples, but they kind of were the old world, the old model of the sedentary world, of the centralized state with a bureaucracy and professional army paid by the state, and a written culture of the great libraries, of the advanced technologies, of the of the universalistic curiosities in many ways. Instead, the Turks and the Germanic world, the Latin Germanic world, were expanding towards a different direction. That was the feudal one. Western Europe was becoming a feudal Europe, thanks to the Carolingian Empire, and the Arab world, the Near and Middle Eastern at this point, is becoming also a sort of feudal world, because there is an injection of all these peoples of the steppes that kind of introduce their chivalric ideals and lifestyles heavily into this region, and eventually the Mongols will give probably the greater contributions, but even the Turks at this point managed to achieve that. So what I find it interesting is eventually that the Arab and Byzantine world fell, and the world was taken over by different peoples that had a feudal origin, and that, however, in turn towards the modern era moved towards a more settled and centralized form. So if you think about the Mamluks, if you think about the Ottomans, well, the Ottomans weren't really much of a feudal society proper, but let's say that was still much memory of the steppes. The Ottomans were extremely obsequious with the Mongolian world, because as Turks, even though they were quite mixed, because Turkish at that point doesn't mean anything practically, because after centuries of settlement in Turkey, these guys had, wherever they were when they came from the steppes, they had, or at that point, diluted into the Anatolian region that is extremely diversified, ethnically speaking, but it has also pretty strongly consistent Indo-European identity. But it was always the idea, and this happened also in the Western world, with the idea of chivalry that doesn't die basically until the 20th century in many ways, that the old world of Rome had fallen in many ways. They took inspiration from it, but they had created another world from different bases, probably more dynamic bases, if we want to be honest, especially in the West, but also in the East, because definitely empires like the one of the Mamluks or the one of the Safavids or the one of the Ottomans were extremely more dynamic entities than the old Abbasid Caliphate in many ways. There were other times, technologies had also improved, there were different times and different worlds. But in this sense, I hope I have given to you, even if a little bit clumsily, can be the idea that what we conceive as the East is not only, and uniformly as the East, is not just the East, but it's actually the sum of many, really many different identities and communities and traditions and languages and beliefs, probably even more than in the Western world, to be honest, and how, especially, the West and the East have culturally a lot in common, and not just because they both drank from the Hellenistic spring during the Middle Ages, and the Arabs brought the Hellenistic manuscripts in the West, and the West began to read it in from the Arab translations, etc. Not just that, because there is always this point, that it was the Arabs who brought, it's always an elitistic perspective, the one of the books. But if we talk about strictly about ethnical identities meant, especially from a cultural point of view, we see that chivalric tradition, for instance, was present both in the East and the West. and that that chivalric tradition stemmed from the common Eurasian steppes origins of the Indo-Europeans and of the Turks. So I'd say think about it when you when you reconsider the Islamic world in this sense. We haven't talked about much about the Islamic world. It was more about the Turks, obviously, but just for saying that as you see dramatically even today, the differences in the Islamic world are incredible. I mean, today, really, the Islamic world, and already at that time, because it began at that point, and even before, paradoxically, is a mess. I mean, you have necessarily to study to understand it. You can't just, simplify and read a book and say, yeah, it's done. I personally don't know much about the Islamic world as such, but I kind of, I think I'm aware of the diversity that lays within it and how many implications, especially in today's international politics, this entails. But however, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please leave a like or share it, or otherwise subscribe to my channel. As always, I thank you very much for listening. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.